Hey there, and welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I am your host, Gabrielle Nicolay, and today I am joined by Casey Ehrlich. Casey, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell the good people who you are and what it is that you do.
Well, my name is Casey Ehrlich, and I am the founder of At Peace Parents, which is a parent coaching and education business that is solely dedicated to supporting parents of PDA children and teens through a nervous system and accommodation lens. So it's pretty niche. And yeah, what else would you like to know?
Well, now we're going to talk about what is PDA.
Sure. Um, so PDA in the literature stands for Pathological Demand Avoidance. However, especially people who identify as PDA prefer the term often of Pervasive Drive for Autonomy. And so I am somewhat agnostic to those terms. I think from a researcher's perspective, I like to build on the literature that already exists. But when I'm working with families, it's always about what resonates for the parents and the kids. Um, in the literature, it's been conceptualized as a anxiety-driven need for control. But the way I understand it is actually as a nervous system disability. And I always like to think about root causes. And I know you do too. Like, is this a sensory issue? Is this a executive functioning difference? Is this a social communication struggle? So you can really get at that. What the child is struggling with. So for a PDAer, that's often um, the nervous system perceiving threat on a subconscious level. So what that looks like is a child perceiving threat when they don't have autonomy, freedom, and choice, or when they perceive that, like, you as a parent or a therapist or even another child, like a sibling, is above them or not equal to them. So that actually sets off the nervous system in fight, flight, one pathway, or freeze. So there's two expressions of PDA, the more externalized, which is when you see more like oppositional, defiant, aggressive behavior. And then the more freeze pathway is often looked at as like very highly anxious child. And it's usually when the child hits what's called nervous system burnout or gets close to it that parents identify, oh, this is actually something beyond behavior, to use a term from Mona Delahook.
Our godmother and
Yes.
knight in shining armor. And we are
Yes.
sending good wishes to her. She's had many health complications. And every chance I get, I always tell people, you got to send good thoughts to Mona Delahook. So there we go.
Absolutely. We're sending them right now.
Yeah.
But when things start to impact basic needs, and so a pattern that I've observed from really only working with families with PDA children and teens is that nervous system activation accumulates in the system. And once it reaches a certain point, in addition to impacting behavior, it starts to disable the child or teen from accessing one or more basic needs. And they often can't leave the house or attend school. And that's usually when parents find me. And that's what brought me to this journey in my personal life, was that burnout point with my son.
Yeah. And so you're coming at this from, you're not a clinician, as you will
No.
happily tell us multiple times during this podcast, I'm sure, but but you come at it from a parent who has experienced this. Now, I'm going to just caution everybody, not everybody has PDA. So before you go about diagnosing your children or yourselves with PDA, which people are going to want to do right now, don't. Just hang on a second.
Yeah.
And some of you listening will in fact find a really very well-fitting slot in which to pour all of the things that you've been observing about your child, because sometimes this is the thing that explains all of the other things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do want to talk about burnout in a second, but what are the signs that somebody might have a pervasive drive for autonomy? Or like what is it about children's behavior that we know, okay, this is a nervous system. I'm asking two different questions in the same way, but or in different ways. How do we start to tease this apart? How do we start to understand this before burnout? And then we'll talk about burnout.
Yeah, so there's usually 5 things, a 5 characteristic framework that I encourage parents to think through with their therapists and pediatricians, obviously. The first is that survival drive for autonomy and equality. And what that means is, we often talk about, well, don't all kids need autonomy, and don't all neurodivergent kids even really have, or orchid kids have a very strong drive for autonomy? And yes, absolutely. But what's unique about these kids is that that drive will override other survival drives like eating. So like if even as early as infancy, where a mom is like trying to get their child to, or their infant to breastfeed, and the more she tries to get the infant to breastfeed, the more the infant perceives threat because she's trying to make them do something, right? Or in a moment, like for example, something that's happened with my son and other kids that I can describe, where you say, no, be careful of the fire, or don't go in the street, and their survival drive for autonomy and being in control will actually propel them towards the fire or into the street, where their survival drive for autonomy will override their instinct for safety, right? So that the example with the fire actually did happen with my son, where he, at first it was like, oh, be careful, you're getting near the fire. But the more we said, be careful, the more he fixated on literally getting into the fire. And we had to physically prevent him. But other children, these are extreme examples to illustrate this first point, but this happens where like it's like, oh, be careful by the creek, and then the child like goes into the creek, like under the water.
And it looks like it looks like defiance, it looks like impulsivity, it looks like they're being bad, right?
Yes. But it's almost confusing the degree to which the fixation on the thing that you said not to do is the fixation, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a blanket. Like they wouldn't have fixated on the fire or the water if you hadn't said don't do that, right? And then there's the paradoxes with this first point that we see, where like your child struggles very much to get out the door, and so we're thinking through the sensory lens, and we're like, okay, they need more comfortable shoes because they're avoiding putting on their shoes, and then we need a chart to help them understand the steps because of executive functioning, and maybe we're going to a speech pathologist and we're working on communication strategies, but none of those seem to be helping, and they just refuse to leave the house until it's something that they want to do, and then they put their shoes on, walk out the door, get in the car. And like, yes, the thing that people will say is like, isn't that just any kid? But it's the frequency, duration, and consistency with which this happens, where it's like befuddling to a parent, right? And then the second part is what's called, the second characteristic to look for is what's called equalizing behavior. So when that survival drive for autonomy is going off in their nervous system, you can't always see it. Sometimes it shows up in behavior, but often it doesn't until it comes out in equalizing behavior, which is like a reflexive need to get back to a place of safety through controlling the other.
Mm-hmm.
But the safest or the weakest. So a sibling, or usually the lead parent of the mom. So it's like, you ask a direct question, it sets off the nervous system because they've lost autonomy, and they growl at you every time. Or, they come home from masking all day, internalizing the threat response, and then they start swearing at you, calling you names, taking the leaves off plants, walking on the backs of couches, like trying to get back to a place of safety, or like walking over to their sibling's stuff, breaking it, and then lying about it. And the more you double down, the further into their survival brain they go, and the more extreme the behaviors become.
And the equalizing behavior is what? I'm attempting to exert control over my environment in opposition to whatever's pressing on me. Is that
Yeah.
okay?
So I think of this in terms of polyvagal theory
Mm-hmm.
and the nervous system, of like, if we're in the reptilian brain, right? And we're a reptile, right? We can't get into safe and social. We're at that part of the brain. Then if someone threatens us like a bigger lizard, we don't have like a social group response. We're not
Mm.
necessarily like, oh, I can go to the bigger ape in the community and they'll protect me. We're just like, I need to be stronger and faster and above them. So it's like almost this reflexive response to equalize, where it's like I'm equal to or above you,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it looks like it can look like very controlling behavior, like controlling your line of vision, whether or not you can get up from the couch, whether or not you can use the bathroom, whether or not you can eat, whether or not like
You, the parent,
yeah,
you, the other party, right? Yeah.
um or the sibling,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's this reflexive behavior, but it often starts at this level that just looks like challenging, manipulative, difficult behavior, right? Like they walk in the door and it's normal kid behavior when they're stressed of like, you forgot to put my stuff in my backpack. And if you respond like you would to a neurotypical kid of like, actually that's your responsibility, or I didn't do that, then they double down. And it's this experience as a parent or a therapist where you're using frontal lobe strategies from the rational part of the brain, and their survival response is going deeper and deeper into the fight flight, and it just ultimately results often in like a huge panic attack or meltdown and sometimes violence.
This makes me wonder about the neural mechanisms that are involved here, because you would think that mirror neurons would be working in their favor, and they're not. That's so interesting. Or maybe they
Well,
are.
I think, okay, so like, I don't want to get too dorky, but like,
Oh, bring it.
okay, so for like a lot of kids with a trauma history, or people with a trauma history, or even autistic kids with or without a trauma history, they often can't receive those signals of safety, right? Like, so for
Yep.
example, the middle ear is like, it's like as if you and I were walking in a very dangerous neighborhood. Like, I might not be listening to what you're saying. I wouldn't be tuning into your human voice, which is regulating.
Mm-hmm.
I would be tuning into the like low frequency sounds of footsteps and like a car driving by, because I'm in hypervigilance. So it's like
Yep.
you can't even really reach them when
Mm-hmm.
they're in that state.
Yep.
And so it becomes this counterintuitive moment where instead of teaching
Mm-hmm.
or using a rational strategy, you're really just in like, let's get them back into the thinking brain.
Mm-hmm.
And that can look like bad parenting.
Okay, we're going to go there in a second. Hang on, because we're on number
Yeah.
2 of 5. I want you to get through the 5, because we
Okay.
are going to talk
Third.
about this bad parenting strategy, which is actually
Absolutely.
the parenting strategy to use. But go ahead. Number 3.
Yeah. So once you, and this, I like talking about the logic because then it makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the third part is, and this isn't true for every PDA kid, but it's a feature that I've found pretty consistently, is high masking. So
Mm-hmm.
what that means is looking like two different versions of oneself, like extremely different. So this, and we actually, I know we're going to talk about this, but in the research we just did, this was a feature that we tested of like, is this a pattern that we can observe, which is, the child is completely fine and looks typical at school, and then comes home and parents report they're a totally different child, aggressive, won't comply with everything, but it's really Jekyll and Hyde. And then there's a subset of parents who report the opposite,
Mm-hmm.
where they're very oppositional and extremely quote defiance if it's more in the externalized expression, more fight flight, that, and then they're fine at home. And
Mm-hmm.
then a question I would ask if I were a parent is like, are they masking at home and safe at school, or are they really accommodated at home and then they're past their threshold at school? And it can be either, but high masking, so two different versions. The
And
fourth
just
would be,
pause. Masking means acting like everybody else on the outside, but having an enormous amount of stress, carrying an enormous amount of stress, and bottling and pushing down and resisting an enormous amount of stress internally. And what happens we know this from just basic science, is like, if you continue to put something under pressure, at some point it will explode. And so that's what masking is basically like. I got to do what everybody else is doing, even though that is not how my body, my nervous system, my spirit wants to behave. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I think of it on an even deeper level of
Mm.
like, if this is all happening at the level of neuroception, like the all subconsciously perceiving threat or not,
Mhm.
that if the brain is just like, I'm not unconditionally loved or safe at school, they're just going to internalize the threat and go down the freeze pathway instead of fight flight.
Oh, so okay, so hold on. So this is super interesting. So masking
This
is
is like, go ahead.
internalized threat response.
This is so there's two kinds of masking, right? Like there's
Okay.
masking in the autistic space, which is
What I
imitating
just said, basically.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And I
Okay.
think there's a degree of nervous system subconscious response there also. But the
Mm-hmm.
way I really conceptualize masking for PDA, which people are free to disagree, this is just like what makes sense to me, is that it's not a conscious, there's nothing conscious about it. It's literally just my brain, I'm safe or I'm not, and then we go down fight flight or we go down the freeze pathway. And so for example, like I would actually see my son's face change the moment he turned away from school.
Mm.
Right, he would put in his pacifier. This is when he was still in public school. His face would literally change. Or like the moment I would go pick him up at my mother-in-law's house when we still lived in your neck of the woods,
Mm-hmm.
Washington D.C., the moment we stepped into the house, he would like immediately be a whirling dervish and like his body would change. And she
Mm.
would just be like, what is happening? Right. So it's like this perception, neuroception. So perception is more cognitive, neuroception is really like totally
Subconscious.
just
Yeah.
subconscious. Yeah.
Okay. So
So
interesting.
that's
Keep going. Oh my God, this is so good. 4.
4. um 4 is something that doesn't get talked about a lot in the PDA space, although maybe more so now, and is very paradoxical because it's like, well, if what's driving these kids' responses is the need for autonomy, why can't they play independently or do anything for themselves, right? So this is that the 4th would be the constant need for undivided attention. But to the degree that like a parent can't do laundry and like fold laundry and like talk to the kid while they're doing something else, they actually have to like only be paying attention to them or else there's an escalation. And to me, this relates directly back to that baseline of just always perceiving threat. And the thing that most quickly gives a sense of felt safety is another safe nervous system, but it can't be like split, right? Because I had a grandparent in my grandparent masterclass was like, well, I had 4 kids and I would hang up the laundry and talk, like sing and talk to my kids and like help them with something and then come back. And it helped me understand like that to her, that was undivided attention. But for a parent of a PDA, or this is a visceral experience where if you turn your line of vision away or try and talk to someone else in the home or check your phone or even stop quote kind of entertaining them and like really providing that intentional signal of safety, they immediately start to escalate to the point where there's this cost benefit of like, if you're not giving them undivided attention, something might get destroyed or another child might get hurt. And so it looks like helicopter parenting, but parents are intuitively doing this because they know the counterfactual. Like if they don't.
Right. There's hell to pay. Okay. As you're talking, I am getting stressed.
Oh,
So
okay.
I want to name that. I'm getting stressed on behalf of the parents who
Oh,
are themselves stressed.
sorry.
No. I'm not asking you to apologize, but I want to, part of the reason I'm saying it is because I want to acknowledge that if this is you at home, this is very, very challenging. And if you are having that feeling of like, oh, okay, like of recognition and of being understood, then this is a good thing. And we're going to tell you where to find Casey. And and I don't know if there's an and. Keep going on to number 5, and then I'll figure out if there was an and. Go ahead.
Yeah. So parents will know, right? Like you're going to listen to this and have your response of like, oh my God, that's so stressful, I can imagine. Or you're going to be like, finally, someone is naming my experience. Thank God.
Yeah.
And
oh, I know what I wanted to say. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. It was, we are really, really talking, and you mentioned this earlier, I just want to repeat it. We're talking about duration. We're talking about intensity. We're talking about frequency, and we're talking about manner, essentially. Like what you just said about something being destroyed, right? This is not, this is not, oh, this will pass. Oh, it's a tantrum. First of all, I hate that term anyway, but like these are nervous system crashes that are significant, frequent, and intense.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think most parents on a certain level intuit it, but don't necessarily have the language of the nervous system to distinguish. And so when they're trying to be like, my kid keeps having temper tantrums, and this happened to me.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you need to use stronger consequences. And so you try the parenting strategies, and then it's only when it starts to, like, the child stops eating, like mine, and stops speaking, then you're like, oh, this isn't just behavior. But we don't want parents to get to that point.
No, and that's part of your work. That's the work we're doing at Raising Orchid Kids, where we really, really focus on, and I'm sure you're going to tell us about this too, the antecedents. In other words, what do I have to put upstream in order for the downstream to feel safe? What do I have to do for this child to feel safe in order for them to be able to kind of regulate their nervous system?
Yeah, or just get away from their threshold so that they can access their thinking brain, and we can use all the other great strategies that you guys provide, right?
Yep.
So the last one is the fluctuating and cumulative nature of the nervous system activation. So, often parents get really confused when their child or teen hits burnout or is getting closer to a threshold where you see the basic needs impacted, because they're like, well, did they just become autistic, or did they just become PDA, or is it a regression, or what did I do wrong? Was there trauma, right? And then, once you start more consistently regulating, it can fluctuate depending on the cumulative load of like what's going on at school, how many times did their brain perceive threat, right? And
And if the answer is all the time, then you've got, I have this diagram that I sometimes pull out, and because many, virtually all of the kids that I work with, and all of the kids that you're talking about, only are ever passing through what we might call the green zone, where you're feeling good, regulated, safe in your body, and you can think at all and learn at all. And many of the kids that we're talking about here, they pass through that zone, some less than others, and some for not very much time. And that is that is really problematic. And what you're describing in my head looks like a decreased bandwidth. In other words, if I get to the green zone, it's so small that I don't stay there hardly at all, because now I've got burnout, and my stress responses are just like spiking all the time. And the body, we know, will learn. This is the other thing. I'm sure the neuroscience is going to be interesting on this, but the body will learn that pattern and be like, oh, threat, we know what to do. Boom, like astronomical response to a minuscule event. But that doesn't make it less real.
Correct. Yeah. No, absolutely. And so like the terms I hear, and you might hear these too with non-PDA kids, with parents, but the terms I hear a lot about in this 5th characteristic are, I'm always walking on eggshells. It's constantly escalating, and you don't necessarily know what's going to be the tipping point, right?
And I think that is maybe the difference. That is maybe the difference for me anyway, that's making sense here, is like, Mostly we do know what's going to be the tipping point. Mostly we know that if we went to 3 birthday parties in the same day, that at the end of the day, that's going to be a shit show, right?
Yeah.
But if you're saying, what I hear you saying is right, that this is cumulative, and we don't know where the tipping point is coming, that's an interesting kind of situation.
Yeah. So like I I understand the ABC framework and how helpful it is for many things, but for a parent of a PDAer, it's often like, and this is where the bad parenting comes in, like the choice we make 2 days ago will impact their ability to eat later in the week.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't necessarily know. And so we have to err on the side of accommodating so we can learn their threshold. And so often with PDA kids, we're assuming it's much higher because they don't look traditionally autistic most of the time, right? Like my son and many PDA kids, like super social, super outgoing, socially motivated. The restricted and repetitive interests are social in nature. So it's like instead of a fixation on like trucks, it's a fixation or a special interest in often something social. And so for many practitioners, that's like, well, that can't be
Okay,
autism, right?
That's a different conversation about this can't be
Totally.
autism because, oh my God. And we had Sarah Wayland and Donna Henderson on the podcast to talk about their book, Is This Autism? Because of exactly what you're talking about. Like, that can't be autism. No, actually it can.
Yeah.
But and
Yes.
so let's talk about this. We're laughingly calling it bad parenting. Let's not do that.
Yeah.
Let's call this, what do you call it? Do you call it something?
I call it a parenting paradigm shift.
Okay,
I
perfect.
call it
Nervous system
accommodation
parenting.
parenting. People talk about low demand parenting, but I really prefer thinking about the root cause and then using accommodations and connection, right? People can't
Yes.
connect until they're in their felt safety and thinking brain and can like reciprocate and connect and talk and understand, like access empathy and stuff.
Nervous system parenting. This is what I want to call it.
Or autonomy parenting.
Autonomy. There we go. All right. Well, in the meantime, okay. So what are the features of this paradigm shift in parenting? What does it look like and why do we do it?
Okay, so let me talk to you about my theory of change. Okay, so the main thing about this is really panning way out and thinking about things in a neurosequential way, which is a term that I'm borrowing from Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a specialist in trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it might take a year or more to even get your child's nervous system below where they're at the point of constant fight, flight, and not being able to access basic needs. And so during that time period, we have two goals. We're trying to accommodate the nervous system to get it so it's not activating constantly and it's creating a window of tolerance, like in the trauma literature, right? So we can even see, like, where is my child's resilience? Can they, like, what can they tolerate, right? And then when they have that window and we're creating neural pathways back to the thinking brain, that's when we can model we can model behavior, work on collaborative strategies, and also have that connection, right? But in order to get them there, we often have to engage in things that look like bad parenting. Like instead of encouraging them through something because they, quote, need to get used to it and be exposed to it, which is a valid approach for some kids, we're actually pushing them into a trauma response if we're doing that. And so we want to examine and lower the demand, or instead of focusing on like naming emotions and verbal communication and reciprocal communication, we really want to focus on like mammal to mammal. How am I signaling safety with my facial expression, my voice intonation? Am I sitting below the child? Am I using declarative language? Right?
Okay, pause.
Yeah.
Two things. Trauma is not about what happens to us. This is Bruce Perry too. It's about how we experience it. So
Mhm.
this is a common mistake where we're like, there is no trauma. Well, just because it didn't look like trauma on the outside doesn't mean it didn't feel like trauma on the inside. And so what we've got here when we're talking about PDAers is we've got a brain that is wired for trauma.
Yep.
And so no matter what happens to this brain, it will perceive, maybe not no matter what, but the wide range of human experience, many of those are going to be perceived as traumatic. Capital lowercase t is yes?
Yeah. So I think, like, for example, the three patterns I see from working with hundreds of families who have PDA children and teens are they're usually three primary things or a combination. One is like you have a gentle or an attachment parent or a low key parent where everything's humming along and you don't really you see quirks but not necessarily like struggles with basic needs or this huge behavior, and then the child starts school
Mhm.
and all of a sudden there's no autonomy,
Mhm.
there's pretty high demands, and there's no accommodations, and the kid hits burnout. Or you have a situation like mine where you have an extroverted PDA kid without knowing it, and their behavior is escalating as they get older. And I had a second child and couldn't provide that one on one attention. And as his behavior got worse, what did I do? I did 1, 2, 3 magic. I did positive discipline. I did timeouts. I made him sit at the table. He couldn't have dessert until he finished his first part. He started vomiting. I mean, this is what escalated it. And yes, I traumatized him, not intentionally, but my strict parenting is what where he hit the wall. And then
Tell us how
for
old
some
he was
he
when it
was
was
4.5
okay.
when he stopped eating, stopped being able to walk, and stopped speaking, and was just like kind of feral animal, fight flight constantly, and would like cower in corners, and like we couldn't get near him without him lashing out. And I mean, it was terrifying. Like it,
Yeah.
and I knew enough about trauma because I my doctoral work was in a post conflict area of Colombia, South America, where I was like, this is not just behavior. Like, this is traumatized behavior. And did something happen at daycare? Like, what is happening? Right.
Right. And then we start going. So this my point in bringing this up was we start looking for the source, the source. The
Yeah.
call is coming from inside the house, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then the third is a kid gets diagnosed with ADHD or autism, and then they go down the behavioral modification path, ABA, and then the kid just crashes and burns, even if for a while it goes okay and they comply, because it's just repeated like loss of autonomy, loss of equality, nervous system activation.
I want to say something here because irrespective, PDAers are on clearly a far side of a spectrum of behavior. Nobody is benefiting from a high control, high compliance situation, low warmth. The question is, like, again, what's the fit between the brain in question and the characteristics of the environment, right? So like some brains can handle a fair amount of strictness or lack of structure
Rules.
or lack of rules, right? Some
Like
brains can handle
mine.
that and some
I
really
love
can't.
rules.
Me too. I
I'm
know.
like, give me the routine, give me the Excel spreadsheet, give me the rules, and I'm going to do great. Like,
There you go. Right.
I'm a linear thinker.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so
Okay.
it befuddled me because I had
Yeah.
been very different as a child.
So he's like this, okay, and so then we're going into, I can't remember what you said, but high accommodation essentially.
Yeah, so I didn't go right into this. Everything's been trial and error and learning through my son and then working with others and research and stuff. So the primary element is understanding that when your child is activated, and even when they're not, they have a brain where they're going to be operating often from the survival brain, which is not where we can teach.
Yep.
It's not where we can rationally explain things. It's not where we can change behavior. They're literally not in a place of their brain.
Right.
But when our child says something like, you know, a good example that parents have a really good hard time with is like, you know, I watch my son walk over and like my 4-year-old's 5th birthday party was this weekend. And that's the ultimate feeling of being below for my PDA son. So his nervous system is activated, right? And he knows he's PDA. He talks about it. We call it threat response venom. So we've already talked about the fact that like it's a hard day for him, right?
Mhm.
And we're accommodating up a storm. You know, we get him a present. He brings a friend to the party. He's got lots of one-on-one time. We're using declarative language, all the things, which we always do. But, you know, he's equalizing. So he goes over and like, quote, accidentally kicks over my son's new train set, Polar Express train set, and like accidentally steps on it and accidentally, quote, pushes it aside. And so my husband and I are like, I see that you just stepped on William's toy. And he'll say, I didn't do it, right? And I'll say, okay, honey, instead of trying to teach. Or I'll say, yeah, those trains will sneak up on you, right? I'm de escalating instead of being like, no, I need to change this behavior in this moment. Because every time I do that, I'm disrupting trust and I'm signaling I'm above you and I'm driving him deeper into the nervous system, right? So that's something I call diffusion. And
Mhm.
parents really have a hard time with it because
Well,
it's against our
it's
paradigms.
very
right?
hard. And also, I mean, just like any parent anywhere would usually say, why did you do that? Which in and of itself is problematic for many kids, regardless of their diagnosis. Like,
Yeah.
if you want a kid to lie to you, ask them why they did something or whether they did something. Did you just knock over you watch them knock over the trains and then you say, did you just knock over the trains? We already know they did. Why are we making them lie to us? That's our fault.
Yeah.
So, okay. And what I hear what you're saying is like, that is not the teaching moment. So you're going to de-escalate in the moment, keep talking.
So that's like the diffusion. So I have a framework and I have 12 accommodations that I teach parents and
Okay.
9 of them are like proactive, like all the time, right?
Mhm.
So like providing autonomy, providing equality, and like operationalizing it, right? So like how can you provide equality? Sit on the floor below them when you're talking to them so that like you're preempting that threat response and neuroception of you being above them. Let them climb on the
Sorry, pause, because what you're tapping into, again, and I just want to bring it back to what you said earlier, this is a subconscious activity.
Exactly.
This is neurological wiring. Nobody's doing this on purpose. They arrived this way. It gets me wondering about the mechanisms. Like, is there a virus? What's the cause? Like, that's super interesting to me, but irrespective.
I think it's genetic, like other forms.
For sure, there's a genetic component. I mean, all of these have a genetic component. The question is like, where's the trigger? What's the cause, right? All of that. Okay. But what that is, and I suspect what the rest of the 9 are, and people should take your program if they want to find out what they are. But
sure.
Sitting below someone, putting your body below is a literal sign of submission that that is subconsciously communicating with the nervous system of the other party. Yeah. And parents, they struggle with it because they're going to have to go through their own trauma in order to get to a place where they're even able to submit to their child, which is what they're doing. Yeah. I mean, they're doing it with a good reason.
In the short term.
Thank you. Keep going. Yeah. 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 But so short term, but I hear you saying short term could be this year.
Yeah. My goal is like your child's life throughout adulthood. Like I'm here to prevent intergenerational trauma, suicidal ideation, and like your family falling apart because I've seen a lot of that. And like this is why like parents have to make a paradigm shift because like it might mean your kid's not going to learn to read for a while.
Yeah.
right?
And
Because we're just not going to make
who
them read it.
cares?
But you have to look at it in that long-term vision of like, we need to teach them how to manage their disability. And they can't learn how to do that if they're in their survival brain and don't have a sense of felt safety and connection with us. And
Mhm.
in order to get that, we have to completely shift parenting through a behavioral and teaching paradigm into one of like felt safety, connection, trust, and autonomy. And this is really hard to do when the rubber hits the road because it means when your kid talks back to you, you have to confront your conditioned and sometimes instinctual response of, you can't talk to me like that.
Yep.
Or we don't use those words in the home,
Mhm.
right? Where, I'm not going to try and teach in that moment. And it involves a lot of cost benefit decision making that I think is part and parcel to raising a child with a nervous system disability. Like, for example, if I can't teach my son to stop equalizing because it's a nervous system response against his younger brother, I might have to radically accept that that's true right now and then make a cost benefit decision of like, can I even keep them in the same place? And that has led us to say, you know what, I prefer to have weekends or time with all four of the family members, but actually for the past 3 years we've kept them separate because it's only now that they can interact.
This is a conversation that comes up all the time on the Raising Orchid Kids side. And we had it this week, actually, which was, yeah, in this particular case, the 3-year-old and the 1-year-old can't be in the same room together. Yeah, they can't for now.
Yeah.
But it's painful and it requires a complete revision of the story that all of us as parents write when our children are born. And even before that, I mean, we write this story, some of us from the time that we're like teenagers, we're like, and I'm going to be a parent and it's going to be beautiful and I'll be, and it's not beautiful.
No, it's really hard and there's grief and resentment and trade-offs.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's why I think the disability lens can be so helpful. And I know that's super triggering, but time and again, I think the thing that's most transformative about the work I do with parents isn't the information about accommodations, because once you learn that, it's what do we need to do to radically accept our reality right now so that we can transcend the constraints that we have and find peace as parents, which is the name of my business, right? So it becomes less about the kid and more about the parent, which I'm sure you see,
All the
in your
time.
work. Yeah.
All the time. Oh my God. Okay. So Casey, you and I, as is very often the case, could talk all day long. I feel like I say this to the majority of my guests, which is very funny. But this has been a really special treat. Thank you.
Yeah,
If
thanks for
people
having me.
want to learn more about you, how should they do that?
Well, I'm all over social media.
You are all over social media.
Yes. For someone who likes to spend time in libraries and in books, it's like not really my personality, but I'm all over TikTok, YouTube, Instagram as @peaceparents, also on Facebook. You can also check out 2 of my podcasts, @Peace Parents podcast or PDA Parents podcast, which I started with another mom. That's actually a good starting point. That's going to be less triggering if you're just learning about it.
PDA Parents podcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Awesome.
then my website,
Perfect.
www.peaceparents.com.
Perfect. And we will link to all of that in the show notes.
All right.
And until next time, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.